critique is a really important skill to have, and something we'll be working on, particularly next semester. So before you hit year 2, you have a better sense of critique. But what sits before critique is decisions. You need to know why you're making the decisions that you make. So I've reframed today's lecture. Rather than focusing on the politics of design, we're going to really start thinking about this in terms of design decisions and design critique, and how that could help you become a better designer. All right? Now, we're going to meet a bunch of people today. So the first person we're going to meet today is going to be Landon Winner. We'll be using one of his key writings called Artifacts of Politics. And then we'll meet Don Norman. Some of you might have seen his TED Talks already. He's quite an interesting character. Really fun to watch when he's giving his presentation. And we'll be using his book, The Politics of Everyday Things. And finally, we'll be using Foucault, a series of his writings, but really looking at the issue of disciplinary power, which we've already met, and then biopower, which we're going to talk about today. So we'll start with Winner. Landon Winner writes this article in 1980, and it's not a very difficult to read article. It's not a very long article, but it's a really important article because he lays out a way of thinking about technology. Now, one of the things that we'll go through this lecture is the definition of technology, right? The way Winner, Don Norman talk about technology is really anything that's man-made or a designed object, right? So when we say technology, we say artifact, we're using them almost interchangeably. So he talks about how artifacts have in them political properties, and there's two kinds of political properties. One is, as he says, the invention, design, or arrangement of a technical device or system which becomes a way of settling an issue in a particular community, which means an artifact or a piece of technology that solves a problem for a group of people. All right? So you've come up with an object or a process or a design that solves a particular problem and what that can then do. Okay? And the second one he talks about is inherently political technologies, systems that appear to require or strongly compatible with particular kinds of political relationships. Here he's talking about larger ideas where you come up with technologies that might require a reconfiguration of how things are organized, or could only work when things are organized in a particular way. All right? So we're going to spend a bit of time unpacking the first one, where he looks at the object itself, or the design of the object, or even how you arrange a series of objects and how that works within a society. So in his article, he talks about city planner Robert Moses. Robert Moses was a city planner in New York whose legacy exists up to today. So a lot of New York public transport system, roadways, organization of space, parks, were designed by Robert Moses. The example that Winner uses in his article are the bridges that Moses built. Now, if you read more about Robert Moses, you realize he's a very complicated character. As a city planner, he had very clear ideas of how society should be organized and who should be allowed to go where. So one of his things that he did was he didn't want people of a certain type, race, and class coming to different areas. So he built roadways, he built overpasses that would confine the height of the vehicles that could travel on the road, such that you public transport buses couldn't use the roads. Now, if you can't afford a car, you have to take public transport. If public transport is not able to get where you want to go, then you're excluded from going to that place. So it's argued that Moses used that kind of systems to keep people that he did not find desirable and prevent them from coming to his space. And you see that replicated in his design generally of roadways. So Robert Moses had a very particular idea. He privileged the car over public transport. And this legacy continues a lot of up to today. The American relationship with cars If you look at the word jaywalking, the word jaywalking was more or less invented by the American car lobby in a way to make walking seem a bit frivolous and pointless, right? So they recast that. They bought up large railway tracks and then make them defunct so they would increase the use of the car. And Robert Moses would design transport systems that would focus and privilege the car as a mode of transport. What this means is, one, it keeps certain people from getting to certain places, but it also means that you're reconfiguring the nature of the city. So he would go straight through neighborhoods and so on, because to him it was more important for certain people to get from one part of New York to the city and so on, as opposed to maybe the people who live in the slums. So that's Robert Moses's legacy. Even the parks he designed, he was a big fan of the parks, were parks that you couldn't get to with public transport. He didn't want his parks sullied by the unwashed masses, right? So he used, his ability to design transport systems and to plan the city to determine how people could and could not move through a particular space. And that meant you managed to use design to exclude people from engaging and moving into the parks and so on. So in this example, Winner focuses more on things like the bridge and how a bridge in itself can function as a barrier. And some of these bridges, a lot of them exist up to today. Most of the highways that he designed are still in existence today. So his legacy continues. So that's the Robert Moses story. The second example we want to look at, where we're looking at systems that require a configuration or a reorganization of how things happen, systems that embody in them power and political relationships. Now, the example that's used a lot in philosophy is the example of the ship. So here we have the HMS Endeavour, which, as most of you will know, was the vessel that Captain Cook arrived on, right? Now, a lot of philosophers use the idea of the ship because the ship has a very clear sense of how it needs to be organized. As a technology, the ship is just what it is, a ship. But in order to make the ship work, you have to organize the people in the ship in a particular way so as to achieve particular aims. So people who are in different parts of the ship have very particular jobs they're supposed to do, and they report to one person. That person then works with another group of people, and they report to another person. That creates not only a hierarchy within the people who are working on the technology of the ship, but it also necessitates a particular political structure. It's run in a very authoritarian, top-down, hierarchical way. And the argument is that you cannot organize a ship in any other way. A ship is not a democratic space. That's why the idea of the mutiny is such a scary one for people who are on the ship. That's why people who committed mutiny were considered treasonous and had to die, because they would upset the running of the ship and essentially bring it to a halt. So what Winner talks about is, when you look at something like the ship, embedded in the function of the technology is a necessity to reorganize how people work in that space, how people move in the space, the kind of things they can and cannot do, the kind of political power they can and cannot exercise. So here, it's not the technology alone that's interesting, but the fact that the technology means we have to rethink how those spaces work. Who's allowed into the space? Who has what rights within the space? So it's not as simple as saying this object does this, or this object has this particular impact, like a bridge. There's also this other level of complexity that says, well, this object then has to work within a particular configuration of political and power relationships. So these things that Winner is talking about are a way of building sense, order in the world. It's a way of organizing ourselves, but also organizing our perceptions of the world. Now, one of the reasons why the ship idea or motif is so used often in philosophy is that it presents to a lot of people a very idealized version of a particular type of society, right? The ship was also analogous to how you would perhaps portray the absolute monarchy, where you had a king, then you had a court, then you had your aristocracy, then you had your working class, your serfs, and all that kind of thing. It echoed a very similar system. All right. So Winner says, in the process by which structuring decisions are made, different people are differently situated, possess unequal degrees of power as well as unequal degrees of awareness. So going back to the ship, yes, you depending on where you are, you have different power relationships, but sometimes you're not actually even aware of the kind of things that are being done to you. You might not be aware that the entire tram system is designed to do one thing. It's not designed to take you home. It's not designed to take you to your friend's house. The tram system in Melbourne, if you look at the map, is designed to get you to the city to work. That's it. That's why it's not designed to move people across suburbs, right? It's all coming into one space. It has a particular reason it's made in that way. So Winner goes on to talk about what those things effectively mean. Those features, how we design things, how we arrange things, and the technology is the way, are a convenient means of establishing patterns of power. Right? We did this in lecture one where we looked at the lecture space and how the relationship of the teacher works and so on and so forth. It defines how we have the power relationship. The consequences for society must be understood with reference to the social actors able to influence which design and arrangements are chosen. That means the people who are making the decisions, the designers, have to be aware and conscious of what they're doing and the impact of what they're doing. Whether it is through political power, whether it's through monetary power. So you see at this point in time with all the recent debates in the newspapers, there is a reconfiguration of Australian society going on. The people who are have influence are reconfiguring it. And there are a whole bunch of people who feel that they, because of not having influence, are no longer able to engage in the dialogue of how they think their society should be organized. So that's the kind of thing Winner is talking about. The initial choice about whether or not to adopt something is decisive in regard to its consequences. When you're talking about the second level, where you're looking at reconfiguring political and power relationships, what Winner says is that is actually quite, it's more significant in the sense that once you commit to it, that's it. You know, you sort of go down the road of no return. Versus if you build a bridge, you can unbuild it. You can build a higher bridge. But when you create entire systems, when you design entire systems that embody and empower in political relationships, the decisions can have a lot of serious consequences. So just keep those two things in mind. There are objects that have politics and what they do, and then there's the design of systems and arrangement of systems which reconfigure or reinforce conventional political and power relationships. So Don Norman, in his book, The Politics of Everyday Things, and if you're interested in the book, the library, you can read online through the e-copy. Just out of note, the most recent edition is 2013, I think, and you can get the ones before that. If you have the money, get the new one, because it's actually quite substantially rewritten. So it's quite, I think it's a better book. So in that book, he talks about his idea of human-centered design, where he defines it as an approach that puts human needs, capabilities, and behavior first, then designed to accommodate those needs, capabilities, and ways of behaving. Now, where he's coming from, he's looking at it as an engineer. So Don Norman's training was as an engineer, right? And he was brought in to look at certain systems and why things happen. So the system he talks about in his book is the 3 Mile Island incident, nuclear incident in the States. I think he also in previous books talks about the Chernobyl incident. And the notion that it's human error that led to the objects going wrong, the design, things going wrong. He puts the argument that it is not human error so much as bad design that doesn't prevent or human error or doesn't guide people to do the right thing that is the problem. So the notion of human error when dealing with technology in his mind is not a real thing. It is actually the failure of the design of the technology that leads to human error. And that is what needs to be fixed. So you have to think about how you design. So those of you who are into apps and web-based stuff and whatnot, or actual making objects, that's a really key thing. Right? One of the things he talks about is dealing with engineers. To engineers, these are the logical ways of doing things. If only you read the manual, you know how to make it work. But almost no one reads the manual. And Don Norman makes the point that people are not always logical. They do things in far more intuitive ways. So your design has to be intuitive. So in that sense, rather than putting what is the best thing we can do with this technology, how can we make this technology more efficient or more functional and so on, he's saying, well, what do people actually want? Let's find out what the audience wants, what's the user wants, what's the customer want, and design the object to best suit their desires rather than continuing to be more and more efficient. One of the key things I like about what Don Norman says is that it's relatively easy to design things that work smoothly and harmoniously as long as things go right. Right? But as soon as there is a problem or a misunderstanding, the problems arise. And there is where good design is essential. And I think that's a really interesting way to rethink how we go about designing systems or processes. We always think this is the most logical way. So if you did this from A to B, to C to D, no worries. But what happens when you meet the abhorrent user, the delinquent user, who breaks your system? How is your design going to talk back to them to let them know you've done something wrong, you're going to break the system, this is what you need to do, and so on and so forth, right? And that, I think, is a really important idea and focus. He talks about human-centered design as needing a good understanding of people and the needs that the design is intended to meet. I think I've typed that slightly wrongly. The need the design is intended to meet as opposed to the design itself. At some point this might seem obvious to you because we've been talking a lot about that. We've been doing pairs and shares. We've been doing audience testing in the classroom. In another world, you might even call those type of things prototyping. We're sort of thinking about our audience a lot more. But that is something that tends to get overlooked a lot. And I think it's really important to look at the kind of things Don Norman is talking about. Because sometimes it's about making people fulfilling their needs. And the thing he says that's also interesting is the method he puts forward. Rather than interviewing people or engaging people, sometimes all you have to do is sit and watch what works and doesn't work. So I like how RMIT, if you come up from the road on the front of building 80 and you go up the escalator, they flip them around, right? And it's kind of counterintuitive to flip the direction of the escalators around, but it makes perfect sense if you stand there and you watch how human traffic would interacted before they flip them around. Right? You as a user might not be aware that that's a problem. Right? It's a minute thing that you have to respond to. But within the design itself, that can be a significant problem. So he says that perhaps the only way you can do it is to actually through observation, because a lot of times the user themselves are not aware that they're encountering a problem. Human error is an interesting one. A lot of times we think something goes wrong because we stuffed up, there's a famous saying where they talk about the error is between the keyboard and the monitor. Have you heard the phrase? The idea that technology never goes wrong. The error is always about the human. It's always putting the blame on the human. as opposed to saying maybe the technology is badly designed. And we'll talk about that a bit more. Two things he talks about, and you can read more in his book. So these are all a bit summary-like and at some point a bit of a simplification. He talks about notions of discoverability and understanding. So he defines discoverability as, is it even possible to figure out what actions are possible and when and how to perform them? So when you encounter a design, is it kind of obvious to you what you're supposed to do with it? When I put an object in front of you, or I put an artifact in front of you, do you just go, oh, this would suggest I do that? Oh, here's a switch here. Most switches you flip, something will happen. There's a button, I'm supposed to do that. And so on and so on. How easy is it for you to understand what you can do with it? Right? And what are the signs that let you know that? Then he talks about understanding. Well, what does that mean? How am I supposed to use the product? That is an interesting thing by itself. There are a lot of products out there that when you pick them up, the use of it, if you don't have prior knowledge, is actually quite complicated. Right? So you have to have prior knowledge. So he's asking, well, what does it mean? How am I supposed to use it? What are all the different knobs and buttons and levers and things like that going to do? Right? If I press this, will it break? If I press that, will it break? You might encounter this if you're talking to your grandparents or so on with computers. There's always this fear about how to delete the internet, right? Because they are not as literate as we are with what those things mean. But at the same time, you don't have an analog world experience to relate to some analog technologies because they're no longer part of how you do things. So in his book, he actually breaks it down into a variety of things like affordances, mapping, concepts, and I think he's got 7 markers. But I've sort of tried to summarize what he's talking about there. So I think he talks about this discoverability as understanding in these 4 ways. That as a designer, you make a promise to your user. Every design you make is a promise that you make to your user. And you then start having that conversation with your user through your object. Now that might not be something you think about in those terms, but I always think everything speaks to me. Everything has a story, right? So as a designer, you make a promise and then you speak to your user through your design. So your promise you make to them is, if you get this object, it will do what you think it's supposed to do. Right? It's as simple as that. And then you start the conversation. Through your design, you then guide the user on what they can do and what they cannot do. Your design should be obvious to me as the user how I'm supposed to interact with it. Right? What can I do with it? What if I did to it will break it? Ideally, it will warn me before I break it. Then you start anticipating your user talking back to you. Your user will talk back to you. Right? In anything you make, your user is going to talk back to you. You guys have already had conversations today. How many of you took a lift today? What happened when you press a number? Made a sound? Or it lights up? That's the lift talking to you. Whoever designed the lift panel, you've had a conversation with them. The conversation was, here's my promise. If you press one of these buttons, it will take you to that place. Go on. And you press it, and then we'll get you there. Choice, right? When you go into a lift and the buttons don't light up or they don't do anything, there's always anxiety. So if you go to the lift behind Dracula's, the car park, right? Half the buttons don't light up. So there's always that anxiety where people getting to press it once and you go, just make sure. Third time, There's some people I've seen who don't know the lift is not that good, who will get off at the wrong floor because to them they'd rather get out and not be trapped in the lift because the floor they wanted didn't light up. Alright? So that's what I mean by you are actually engaging in all these discussions. As a designer, you have to anticipate what feedback, what is your user going to say to you, and then you have to design for them an appropriate response. So you're doing a lot of complicated things here. Not just making something and throwing it into the wild and hoping somehow it will just sort itself out. No, you have to go, all right, I'll make this. What will my user do with it? How can I make sure that when they do something, they get the right response? Which is, yes, you're on the right track. No, you're on the wrong track. My design can do this. No, my design cannot do that. So your challenge is to design in anticipation. And how you do this is by relying on the user's understanding of the world. So you actually have to understand how your user sees the world so that you can then speak to them in their language. So being a designer is a really complicated and intellectual activity. You're doing all these things even through something as simple as lift button design, which is something we'll look at. We're doing a bit not so good for time, so I'll speed up a bit through the examples, but I'll just quickly talk through this. What is this? It's a hob. It's a hob, right? What do you call it? Hob? You know hob? Stove. That's right. So it's a stove. It's also called a hob. I'm old school. What can I say? So when you look at that, you have no idea which knob refers to which hob. It's a word, I'm telling you. Okay? So you don't know which one maps against which one. So as a design, this is a poor design. And this is an example from his book. Whereas if you had something like that, it's mapped more clearly. You know how it's supposed to correspond. So, bad design, good design. Bad conversation, good conversation. The other example, so if you Google this thing called Norman doors, right, people have started saying that, is doors that don't work. So when you come up to this, how would you open the door? Turn it? Spin it? Do not turn to open. Right? It's counterintuitive because if they didn't have that, yeah, of course you turn it. That's what it looks like. So this is what I mean. So when you put an object there, your understanding of the world says, that's how I'm supposed to engage with it. It's a wheel thing, wheels turn, so I'll turn it. Right? And I can bet with you many times people have walked up to this and just sort of ignored the writing and tried to turn it. Right? So Don Norman talks about a Norman doors in the sense that when you walk up to the door, you go, do I push or pull? If it's a flat metal panel, that usually means push. If it's a handle, that usually means pull. If there's a handle on both sides of the door, you don't know, you try your luck. Right? And there's a lot of these doors. There was once I went to a door in LaSalle University in Singapore, their main door. You walk to it and it's a really confusing door because it's a big piece of wood and it's got handles on both ends. How do you open it? Where do you open the door from if you've got handles on both ends? It's got a center pivot. So the whole door shifts. But it's really confusing. You walk up to it and you have to think about it. All right? So you can do design in that way, but it's meant to have a particular thing. You're asking the audience to do something. All right? So that's the Don Norman. You can read his book for more ideas. The one he talks about earlier that had pictures of was glass. How glass can do a variety of things. He talks about how glass is transparent, but non-porous. So it lets you see through things, but it blocks you from getting to them, which in itself is a design feature that almost at some point seems to contradict each other. All right? Now, the next person we want to look at, and we've met him before, is Michel Foucault. Now, we've looked at his, so this is from his book, Discipline and Punish. We've spoken about this in lecture 1, where he talks about disciplinary power regulates the behavior of individuals in a society, and this is done by regulating the organization of space, time, movement, and activity. And we looked at this in terms of the education system, the way the university is set up, timetables, and all those kinds of things. So that was in week 1. If you want to remember that, you can go back to that week 1 lecture. So I'm not going to spend too much time. But he talks about the idea that these disciplinary technologies make the individual. They constitute who you are, right? So something like taking the train, you would realize how badly they make you because it doesn't really work. In the same book, he also talks about how disciplinary power is often invisible, right? So we spoke about invisible in terms of either things that we have stopped seeing, right? Like the toothpaste or doors, versus the things that we cannot see, knowledge systems, right? So keep those ideas in your mind. We're talking about disciplinary technologies that make the individual, which are both visible and invisible. And we just want to complicate the matter by adding an idea from his History of Sexuality, Volume 1 book, where in the final chapter, he talks about biopower. And this is it's a development on his idea of disciplinary power. Biopower both disciplines the body, so the things that's done to you, but also is used to manage populations. So the things that's done to you impacts you as an individual, but there's also things that are done to you at a higher level where it impacts large people, large groups of people, and populations. So he talks about the rise of capitalism. With the rise of capitalism came this idea of the state. The state as we know it, that means your government, your country and all that, as we know it now, is a very recent construct, right? And he talks about how this came about as other things were changing in life, and you saw the disillusion of absolute monarchies and the rise of parliamentary or more democratic models of governance. The state and its apparatus of power moved to privilege life through and in the daily practices of their citizens. What does that mean, privileged life? Traditionally, most societies are organized through death. Stay with me on this, all right? They're organized through death. Because the state itself, the absolute monarch and so on, has no interest in having you be anything more than producing output, right? And as we started to look at parliamentary democracies and the rise of the neoliberal state, now some of this stuff might not make sense to you, but just sort of stay with me for a while. You saw a privileging of a move from negative to positive ways of positioning the power. And here we start talking about the idea that the government now actually actively intervenes in trying to tell you to be a better citizen, to be healthier and do all that, whereas they wouldn't in the past, right? An example is how we treat prisoners. The prison system, back in the day when you did something wrong, what did they do? Most of the time they just killed you and they moved on in life. Why did they do this? If you robbed someone, why did they kill you? Because everything belonged to the king. Even though it was yours, right? You might work for me, you might be a serf. When you die, I get your things because I own you. The clothes that you wear come to me. Right? And it all goes that way. So when you stole something, it was looked upon as you've stolen it from the king. And as such, when you steal from the king, surely there can only be one outcome. As that power started to get destabilized and start to lose its focus, we started also seeing other things, the poorhouse and things coming about, schools, hospitals, or the prison system, where now they said, all right, we're no longer going to kill people, we can reform them, we can make them good again, we can make them better people. So it goes from being negative in the sense to positive, and that's where the rise of the modern state and capitalism and neoliberalism all comes together. As the neoliberal state evolves, power moves from the body to the population, from negative to positive. So the focus is less on you as an individual, but more on the ideas and managing the population at large. So what he talks about is, unlike this discipline, which is addressed to the body, the new non-disciplinary power, biopower, is applied not to man as body, but to the living man as the living being, ultimately, if you like, to man as a species. The idea that we now had a sense of almost being an entity that could be made better. Now, there's a lot of other things that come into this, right? The reformation of the church and power structures and all that. So it is a bit of a complicated idea. There's a lot of richness there. But what our important takeaway is to understand that biopower is not just focused on what things are done to the individual, but what are the things that are done to a large group of people, populations at large? Why is this important? So if we connect back to what Brad was talking about last week, right? The problem of neoliberalism is rather the overall exercise of political power can be modeled on principles of a market economy. So it's not a question of freeing an empty space, but of taking the formal principles of market economy, relating to them and projecting them on the general art of government. What does this all mean? Basically, it's saying we are now looking at a way we structure ourselves in society from not just focusing on how things are exerted on the individual, but it's actually a more interesting and less visible force that governs who we are and what we do. And a lot of this is driven by neoliberalism and the rise of capitalism, which is designed to try to create the better worker, the more productive citizen, the happier citizen, and so on. That's the same slide. So, which brings us back to these three people. How do we tie them up? How can we use the three things that we've looked at together to help us achieve a way of thinking about design decisions and a way about thinking about design critique? So when we talk about Winner, he talks about how objects themselves do things, right? Have political qualities. He also talks about how the large systems, the large designs, reconfiguration of political and power relationships, how those can impact what you do. Norman talks about the designer's role in doing those things. Norman's focus, though, is really on the relationship between the designer and the user. What we want to do is add the Foucauldian notion of biopower to that and look at how people are designing for populations. And how, when you design for a population, when you're designing large systems, large ways of thinking, you inherently are doing one of two things. You're either reinforcing status quo, or you're trying to reconfigure status quo. Quite a lot to try to unpack, but we'll do some fun things in class tomorrow that hopefully will unpack this a bit more. Now, I've spoken to you a few times already about this issue, which is the buttons. The emergency buttons and why they are where they are and they're next to each other and so on, right? We've had this conversation in class. The next conversation I'm interested in, why are the buttons different? Why do they look the way they look? And who can use them? Now, button design is something that I find quite fascinating. Because to me, inscribed in a button is a lot of ideas. So this is a button panel that you're familiar with. All right? It's cut off the bottom of the screen, but it says it's a Building 9 lift button panel. The buttons are there. They don't light up, but the rings light up. Door close, door open. Directly below the door close is emergency. Right? Alarm button. The numbers go left to right, left to right, left to right. Kind of a simple design, not very complicated, right? The question is, what is it assuming about the user? What knowledge does the user already have when they walk into that space? First and foremost, there's an assumption that all the users know what a lift is. Right? There's an assumption that they know how to engage with the lift. And there's an assumption that they know that these buttons are doing something. So go back to Building 9 and walk into the lift and look at the design features of the lift. And you'll see like, oh yeah, okay. If I walk in the lift and I didn't know anything, I would know the buttons are doing something because there's no other design feature. There's a handrail, but that doesn't really do anything either. Right? So you know you'll be involved in this kind of process. Okay, let's look at another one. This is this building. Alright? Again, same setup, door closed, alarm, open. But what number does it start with? 2. Where's 1? Where's B? Previous one, they had a B. B for basement. This starts at 2. All right. Something weird is going on. That's fine. Maybe it's 2. Where do I get up? If there's no 1, where do I get up? How do I get to street level?
You're on straight level.
Sorry?
You're already on the straight level.
No, because you'll have to, for people on top, they'll have to come down to 1 if they don't.
But the lowest one will be the lowest.
That, well, that's the assumption that the lowest will take you to the lowest floor. Lowest floor is usually...
It will take you to the lowest floor with the lift on it.
Yeah, the lowest floor with a lift on it. But where's street level? Okay? If you go to the design hub, you'll encounter the same problem. You get into the lift, you go up, it's all good, and when you leave, you go, oh, must be 1, you press 1, and it goes into an area where there are no doors, it's black. What do you do then? Where's street level? Alright? So this is not communicating to the user some really important vital information. Where is level 1? How do I get out of the building? Now, if I'm not wrong, and you should try this out later, I believe level 2 is actually the floor that's street level with the back of the building, and 3 is street level with the front of the building. I suspect. Alright? In the Design Institute, I think it's level 3 or 4 that's Swanston Street level. But it's not on the panel, so you're assuming that the user knows all these things. What about this one? This is at SIM University in Singapore. What's missing there? Certain numbers are missing. What would you then think is happening? The buttons are still there.
Yeah.
Right? So you would think it could be a variety of things. They forgot to put the right buttons. They ran out of buttons. Or maybe those floors are not for me to access, but they're letting me know I cannot access them.
There's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6.
Exactly. The other design feature that's slightly different is the alarm button is next to the door open and door close button, which in the previous ones it was under the door close. Now, I've always thought that the alarm button should be as close to the door open, because when shit hits the fan, you want the door to open. Why is it near the door close? That's the last thing I want to press. Also, many a time I've seen someone press the alarm button because they're trying to close the lift door and they're not looking carefully. Right? You see what I'm saying? So that in itself, to me, it's an interesting thing. Now, this is the lift next to the other lift, and the other numbers are there. You can see all the numbers. All right? Because that's the express lift for the people who work there. This is the lift for the students. So the students need to go to all the floors. The staff who work there work on 5 and 6. All right? Something's going on there. What about this one? Slightly better. You can't quite see it, but it says there level 3 is health club, level 2 is ballroom. The one with the star, level 1 is lobby, and 16, 17 are concierge. What's missing? Why? Sorry? Superstitious, unlucky. When I go to teach in Singapore, the hotel I stay in doesn't have a 4th floor. Anybody know why? What does 4 sound like in Mandarin? There. Alright? So there's no 4th floor. See, I'm telling you, there's a lot of interesting conversations being had.
Where is this elevator?
This is in the States. This is in the States. Right? And again, the emergency button is above the door open. So it's still near the door open, not near the door closed. But no 13. Okay, that's alright. This button. Alright, you could spend a bit of time and start to figure it out. Okay? Obviously, there's only 3 floors. One with a star. Maybe that's where all the celebrities hang out. And then there's lower and upper. And there's 2 doors, so you can open the front door, open the rear door. But they have an alarm button and a stop button. They don't have an open or close button. Right? And then they have a push to call button. So call and alarm are different, like and the stop. Alright? There's very particular reasons this lift is the way it is. It's a goods lift. So you need to stop it because you can't have when you're loading goods for the lift to constantly be going up and down with your goods going up and down. Right? So it's designed to do particular things. But again, if you're not in that space, you're not in the environment, you wouldn't know that. You would ask, why is that an issue? Okay? What about this one? This is supposed to be a car park lift in a hospital in the US. I have no idea. I can't figure it out at all. I've looked at it a lot, and I don't know at all what it does. It's got no door open, but it's got a door closed. It's got alarms. It's got a way to switch the alarm off, which again, I don't know. But so there's something weird going on here. This would make sense to someone who's in the space maybe and knows what black, red. There could be parking levels, black and red and so on. So they don't use numbers. Although a colored tan, I always think is, tan. So brown. Bridge, walkway, and things like that, right? So complicated things are going on. Now this one I bring up because I want to talk about this button. We don't see these buttons anymore, but those are those buttons I'm talking about. Plunger style buttons. Right? So they actually are the type you have to push down. To understand a plunger button, let's go back up to our buttons. These are kind of clear. You walk into the space, it's a design feature. Sticks out. Right? It sticks out, it's kind of obvious. Now when you go to Singapore and you go into the sim lift, these are flush against an entire lift that's brushed stainless steel. So the whole lift is the same texture and these are flush. Right? You can't always see them clearly. What is happening here is that whoever designed the buttons or decided they should be put in the lift made a certain assumption about the literacy of the people who are going to use the lift. That they understand lift buttons, so you don't have to have something that's designed so obviously to extrude out. They can be flush and sort of meld with the system. Alright? Sorry, just give me a sec. Almost done. So the reason I wanted to end on this slide about, well, we've got one more slide, but the lift button design is to talk about all those lift buttons are designed to have a particular impact. Those lift buttons are conversations you have almost on a daily basis. You got to think about why the lift buttons are the way it is. Why is the alarm button so low? Because children keep pressing it, right? Shouldn't it be high where the adults can get to it, right? Because naughty kids are always pressing alarms, right? No. Because people in wheelchairs can't reach that high. There's very particular reasons. Australian standard, I think 1375 or 1275, one of those. There's actually rules around lift design. We haven't spoken about even the size of the doors and all those kinds of things. There are very clear rules on what a lift is supposed to do. So when you start looking at things like that, you realize there's a certain amount of assumptions that are made. So if I was asked to make a lift in a country where people were not used to taking lifts, I would make buttons like that are very obviously big and they know that you're supposed to do something with it. If I made a touchscreen button that went to screensaver, you would have people standing there looking at the screensaver all day. Do you know what I mean? Unless you have a literacy that there's such a thing as touchscreen. Alright, to conclude, where does this leave us? Like I said, to me theory is only interesting when I can apply it. So the question is this. These are the key questions from today's lecture. How is the artifact, so these are the things you can use yourself as a designer to interrogate yourself. How is the artifact itself political? Right? So these are the Robert Moses Bridge type question. How is the artifact, the object that you've designed itself, political? What are the political relationships that the artifact is involved in? All right, with the user, with the designer, is there a hierarchy involved? Does it need to reconfigure power relationships, or is it staying the same? Who is the design interacting with, and how does it do that? So this is about your user, your audience, right? Who is the design interacting with, and how does it do that? And then you ask yourself, who is my design excluding? Are there people I want to exclude? Am I conscious of their exclusion? And what are the design elements that excludes people from engaging with my design? How does the artifact make the individual? So these are things that we talked about, toothpaste and so on. How does it make you? And to what end? Why is it making you that kind of person? How does the artifact make the population? And to what end? So remember we spoke about discourse and knowledge. So that's the last question. What knowledges does the artifact use and contribute or contradict? Because remember, all your designs have to live in a space of knowledge, regimes of truth, and so on. They have to use what people know, but they also have to plug into ways of thinking. So again, when we talk about toothpaste, you can use all these questions to interrogate toothpaste, right? So on and so forth. When we come to the last three questions, these are the ones that get complicated for us. How does the toothpaste make the individual, and to why? How does the toothpaste make our population, and why? And finally, what do I need to know so that I want to use the toothpaste? I know why I'm using it. I'm motivated to use it. And does that establish or reinforce the status quo? Or does that contradict and destabilize the status quo? So tomorrow in the tute, we'll do a couple of run-arounds and learning activities where we will unpack these questions in more detail. All right? I know that was a lot to sort of put together today. I appreciate you all paying attention for the full almost hour. Thank you very much. I'll see you tomorrow.